Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge. I'm the convener of the Social Capital Research Group. And in this session, I'm going to be giving a presentation exploring the theoretical foundations and meaning of social capital. And this is something that I've been working on for a very long time. I first started becoming interested in social capital about 20 years ago when I was doing my master's at the University of Queensland in Australia. And I was really interested in investigating land care groups, which is a form of natural resource management group in Australia. And I was interested in why some groups seem to perform really, really well, just with a limited amount of government funding, and other groups didn't perform quite so well. And I felt there was some social dynamic there, that the connections that people were bringing to those groups and the ability for people to work together played a really important role. And I wanted to understand that better. At the time, so this was 20 years ago, I didn't feel like the concept of social capital could be applied in my research in a way that would generate the kinds of answers that I wanted to find. And so for my master's, I switched to studying the theory of social capital and trying to uncover what it is really about and develop it in a way that might help us to be able to apply it in research. So after my master's, I then built socialcapitalresearch.com, which basically presented most of the information from my master's. And that's been a resource online now for 17 years that helps people to understand the concept. That's kind of really the goal of the website. And I've added to it over the years, and it now has over 250 articles. And it's probably visited by nearly 1,000 people a day. So it's a really important resource for social capital. And this presentation really is piecing together the ideas that I've developed and the ways that I've been able to formulate these ideas over the years to try to help other people, other researchers. So in terms of an overview, just get this moving, radio. So I want to provide a bit of background first. So we'll start by discussing the theoretical foundations of social capital and why they're so often uncertain and confused. And also why there are so many different approaches. So what actually leads there to be so many different understandings of the concept of social capital, but also what the core ideas or components of social capital theories may actually be, because there's such huge diversity, but there are some similarities there, and we may be able to identify and pull out some of those core ideas. And then the real key part of this presentation is trying to understand differences between the relationships of different theoretical or conceptual approaches. And I've developed a typology that I think can help us to position these different ideas visually and help us to understand them a lot better. So before I get started, I wanted to clarify a few things first. First one being that what I'm trying to do here is create these conceptual boxes. So these approaches fit here and these approaches fit over here. But of course, reality doesn't divide neatly into boxes. And what we see is an enormous amount of variety, and it can be very difficult to make those kinds of distinctions. So a lot of the things I'll say are really just generalizations that are generally applicable, or maybe even only sometimes applicable. But it's important to make these sorts of conclusions because it helps us to organize and understand our thoughts. Another important point is that I try not to preference any single theory or explanation or methodology. There's lots of different ways of understanding the world, from economic type approaches and methodological individualism to very sociological, philosophical approaches. Every discipline tends to approach these problems with slight differences. And I try not to focus on any one and understand and value the contribution that all of these different approaches can make. I don't always do that particularly successfully because of course I have my own worldview that I bring to this, but that's my goal, is to try to include all of them in the analysis. Also, I just wanted to reinforce that scholars' work needs to be understood within the context within which they created it. You know, if we're talking about some of the early scholars on social capital, they did this work 30 or 40 years ago, and it fits within their school of thought and their era. I think it's important to acknowledge that when we're thinking about and we're talking about their work. And the audience for this presentation really is everybody. I don't want to get into the really deep philosophical and theoretical discussions, because that is a barrier to people from other disciplines to understand what we're talking about. So in general, I'm going to try and keep this in a way that everybody can understand, not just the social theorists or the economists among us. And that's a goal that I'm going to try and take on. So before I get stuck into the confusion and the uncertainty that exists with social capital theories, I wanted to talk about the promise first, because social capital is really, really positive, and I wanted to emphasize some of these ideas in the literature before talking about something that's less positive. So social capital can reprioritize and revitalize how we think about the multiple facets of human activity, can provide a more holistic frame for the study of human action, can highlight the significance of relational social factors beyond under-socialized views, can facilitate interdisciplinary dialogue, provide a common frame of reference for discussions across disciplinary, methodological, ideological, and cultural boundaries, and provide opportunities for trans and interdisciplinary research to break down discipline barriers that limit new ways of understanding social phenomena. So as you can see, there's a lot of potential for social capital to study in new areas, investigate problem spaces, to be able to communicate something that wasn't possible before, to emphasize the importance of these social processes, perhaps that are often overlooked, and that we want to focus on in our research and in our practice as well. So I've talked about the positive stuff. The uncertain theoretical foundations, however, are something that a lot of people in the literature comment on. And after decades of scholarly work, we still seem to be in this situation where there is a bit of uncertainty and it's unclear. So some comments from the literature: confusion and contradiction reign in much of the literature, and that the foundations are often undefined, uncertain, and confused. And Michael Woolcott commented that if social capital can be rational, pre-rational, and even non-rational, what is it not? And Ben Fine talked about how the dominant conceptual approaches to social capital tend to incorporate its determinants and consequences of part of itself, with the boundaries between its parts becoming blurred. And this speaks to the difficulty that we have quite often in separating the source of social capital from what social capital actually is, or its form, and the outcomes or consequences that social capital produces. I think this quote is generally true, but I want to focus specifically on this part here, which is that it's made up of components that do not hang together in a coherent and productive way. And what this is talking about is the fairly unique and somewhat strange combination of things like networks and norms that don't necessarily fit together particularly well. We're talking about quite different types of things. And there often isn't a particularly robust theory that sits behind that for explaining why we're including these different components. So there's certainly a lot of criticism in the literature about the uncertain theoretical foundations. But it's worth going back a little bit and exploring why social capital was coined. What theories did it attempt to modify or extend? What was the purpose of social capital effectively in the beginning? And so if we think to James Coleman, who was one of the early scholars on social capital, he talked about how social capital was a response to the perceived deficiencies of mainstream economic theory. And we see other similar sorts of ideas as well, that it was corrective to Thatcher's idea there is no such thing as society, and that with the use of social capital, it may be possible to kill off the more naive applications of neoclassical theory. And even before this, Glenn Loury, writing in 1977, used the term social capital to criticize the narrowly individualistic and atomistic understanding of human capital in neoclassical economic theory. So I think we see this as a common thread, the need to correct for asocial ways of thinking about the world, and really that relationships matter, the need to reintroduce the social. And when I reflect on my own interest in social capital, this is exactly what I was interested in my application to land care groups in Australia. And when I talk to people, and I talk to a lot of people about social capital, And this is overwhelmingly the kind of idea that they're bringing in. They want to emphasize the social that is typically overlooked and undervalued. So how can social capital be corrective? How can we actually do this? And James Coleman was quite explicit about developing a theoretical orientation that includes components from both economics and sociology, so basically integrating these disciplines. But I think a key question is, how can those ontological foundations be reconciled? They're very different approaches to the theory of human experience and action. And so on the economics side, we have this concept of homo economicus, the basis of humans as agents who are consistently rational and narrowly self-interested, who pursue utility maximization. And that's been criticized as being under-socialized, that it ignores or overlooks the social aspects of human experience. And on the other side of this integration, we have social theory, or homo sociologicus, which is where humans act not only to pursue self-interest, but actions are governed by social norms and rules and obligations, and action is shaped and constrained and redirected by social context. And similarly, this has been suggested that it's perhaps over-socialized, that it overemphasizes the role of social setting in human action and experience. So as an integration of these things, then we could say that homo socio-capitalus is the concept of humans that sits in between. And this is not my top concept or term, this is Ben Fine's term. So really then, what is this concept? How do we reconcile the differences between homo economicus and homo sociologicus, and what is the basis of human experience and action for this homo socio-capitalist? And Ben Fine suggested that whilst the social capitalist is nowhere near as reduced as the homo economicus, it is striking how shallow and incoherent it is. So this speaks to the uncertainty we have about really what the theoretical foundations are for social capital. But there are theoretical foundations. And if we look at where those major sources have come from, then the first person I think we would look at is Pierre Bourdieu, who wrote in the early 1980s, and he had a very strong theoretical foundation. He had concepts such as habitus and fields that provided a really strong and very specific, rich sociological description of the nature of human experience and action. We also have James Coleman, who was working through the 1980s and published towards the end of the 1980s, who was explicitly using rational choice theory and looking to modify rational choice theory. And so again, we have a very strong theoretical foundation of human experience and action that underpins the work that he did. And of course, James Coleman approach was later adopted by Robert Putnam with some modifications, and then further by the World Bank, and has become really the dominant approach to social capital. And then we also have authors such as Nan Lin and Ronald Burt. They represent somewhat different theoretical foundations, but Nan Lin brought to social capital 20 or 30 years of social resource theory, and Ronald Burt brought probably 50 or more years of network theory. So these have significant and strong theoretical foundations that support the work that they originally did on social capital. So we certainly couldn't accuse any of these scholars of being confused about theoretical foundations, but as we've gone along, we've kind of lost these theoretical foundations. So we've moved from explicit, where they were very clear about what their theoretical foundations were, and we've kind of lost it over time. So moved to implicit, perhaps uncertain, perhaps confused, perhaps confounded. So I think most early scholars, particularly those in economics and sociology, were acutely aware of theory and the need and attempt to modify and scaffold from existing theory. However, many scholars, particularly the following scholars from other disciplines, were perhaps a little less concerned with theory, and perhaps rightly so. They were more focused on empirical inquiry and going out and gathering information about the world to bring back to substantiate and to find information about it. And I think Robert Putnam is a good example of this, that he was very focused on the empirical inquiry, and his theory was still there, wasn't missing, but he was more focused on the empiricism. Now, some scholars, unwittingly or wittingly perhaps, divorce social capital from those theoretical foundations. And for some, it was implicitly grounded to theory, but for others, it was just getting divorced. It was just separating entirely from whatever foundations existed. Understandably, for many followers, confused and misunderstandings of these theoretical foundations, we started to see mixes and matches across very different types of approaches. And that uncertainty really coming in, which eventually creates the problems with research design and actually the results of the research. We see tautologies and truisms and these kinds of problems starting to emerge. I think also for many authors, the lack of theoretical foundations made it more palatable to a wider audience. Very deep, rich sociological foundations are a barrier perhaps to people from other disciplines or from other schools of thought being able to adopt the theory. And I think this is the slide that Ben Fine has described as hackademia or hack academia. But really, I think that this paints a very negative picture, and it's not quite this bad, because I think most people really come in up here. Most people bring in their own existing theoretical foundations from whatever discipline or school of thought they're working in. And that's the perspective from which they understand social capital and approach social capital. So if I'm a social constructionist, then I'm not going to just simply abandon my way of thinking about the world when I come to social capital. And of course, I will implicitly perhaps be applying social capital theory from those foundations that I already have. But for scholars who aren't quite so attached and connected to foundations, you can see how it'd be quite easy to slide down this ladder quite quickly. So I think that it was hoped that an evidence-based approach would overcome the concept's conceptual and theoretical weaknesses. However, the concept's weak theoretical foundations frequently undermine the validity of the inquiry that they were doing to try to gather the evidence. The concept was often applied with familiar methodologies without a strong theoretical framework to inform the validity and rigor of the approach. And for a lot of people, I think this led to struggles for legitimacy. And we've seen scholars, including some quite prominent scholars, who have simply moved away from social capital for these reasons, and other scholars who wouldn't touch it with a 40-foot pole because of these kinds of struggles for legitimacy. And certainly the critical literature on social capital has grown in parallel with the concept's rapidly increasing popularity. So I think it's important to explore this dominant approach that we talked about coming from Coleman. Where did it come from, and what were they looking to achieve? And really it started, I think, probably even in the 1970s with the work particularly of Gary Becker, who has largely been ignored in more recent years for his contribution to social capital. So for Becker, social capital was part of an ambitious project that eventually won him a Nobel Prize. And that project was to apply the economic approach to all social activity. In 1976, Becker claimed that the economic approach is a comprehensive one that is applicable to all human behavior. An approach that some have described as economics imperialism, since it invades and displaces alternative theories in the social sciences beyond economics. So by the 1980s, human capital was well established, and he turned to social capital. And he worked with James Coleman at the University of Chicago. And Coleman was a sociologist, but one that Roger Bolton would describe as much appreciated by economists, given his use of rational choice theory. And the tenets of rational choice theory are broadly consistent with methodological individualism and therefore neoclassical economic theorizing. But James Coleman was quite specific about wanting to move beyond the theorizing and to correct for those shortcomings. well, as I mentioned, Becker's influence is largely overlooked. We don't really see him featuring in any of the modern literature and understandings. He's not cited very often anymore. And the reason suggested by Ben Fine was that he was an embarrassment because of his honest and fanatical commitment to the principles of utility maximization as the single explanatory factor for all economic and social phenomena. And that basically, even though Coleman's approach was much the same, it was only explicitly based on rational choice theory and was more palatable for people. So Putnam adopted James Coleman's approach with some modifications, of course, and he was a little bit less concerned with theory. You know, he didn't go extensively into talking about rational choice theory and the modification of theory. He was much more focused on the empirical inquiry that he was engaged in. But his work is still explicitly, well, not explicitly, implicitly based on the same sorts of ideas as James Coleman. Law and Mooney, in an article in 2006, described how Putnam borrows from neoclassical economics, game theory, and rational choice theories of collective action. So the same underlying theoretical foundations really exist there, but they aren't quite so explicit. And of course, Putnam contributed to the World Bank's approach on social capital, and the economists within the bank shaped quite a similar kind of end result. And this is really the dominant approach that we see to social capital theorizing. So the conclusion then is that it corrects for the asocial without much deviation from neoclassical axioms. I think this is really quite understandable. I don't want to criticize them, as I said in the very beginning. We need to understand scholars' work within the context of their school of thought and their era in which they did this work. So at that time, perhaps a little less so now, but still also now, there was this belief in that it must be scientific and it must be objective, it must be tangible. And so they worked very hard to modify and correct for the lack of social in neoclassical economic theorizing, but without a huge amount of deviation from it. But ultimately, the work that they did has allowed us to have the conversations that we've had and to progress the ideas that we have. And I think we need to respect and value that work that they did. But unfortunately, focusing on that, that there's very little deviation from neoclassical axioms, typically underperforms. It generates new knowledge, absolutely, but it could be better. We could produce more new knowledge. And in some cases, it may actually reinforce the problem. So I think we can look at ways in which we might be able to do better. So what can we do about this? So to date, most attempts to build foundations have just defaulted to methodological individualism and reductionism because that's what we know. That's currently really what our episteme, our paradigm pushes us towards doing. But of course, to be effective, we can't start with that. And conceptualizations of social capital that start from methodological individualism and attempt to add back in the social are unacceptable. So these authors go on and say, if social is given legitimate treatment and meaningfully included in analysis, then the isolated individual of the economist's imagination ceases to have any legitimacy. So it's pretty strong words to suggest that we need to do things a little bit differently and have some different theoretical foundations. And really, I think the solution is obvious. So we need a more balanced theory or philosophy of human experience of action. And I think that really needs to be emphasized. But a key question here is, will it actually be accepted in the current episteme at the current time? I suggest that it wasn't going to be particularly well accepted in the 1980s. I'm a little more hopeful now, but I'm not sure. So I see this really is the potential for social capital. We have the under and over socialized views. Perhaps Homo socio-capitalist could be the Goldilocks, the perfect combination, not too hard, not too soft. Certainly presents this opportunity for the inter and multidisciplinary approaches and understandings. We don't need to be bound to monodiscipline understandings of human experience and action. We can potentially include rationality, as well as the socially situated and subjectively defined, as well as lessons coming out of psychology and social psychology about cognitive processes, as well as things like morality and emotion and feeling and so forth. We don't need to be limited to just utility maximization as the only concept of human experience and action. So I've just been digging into some pretty deep theoretical foundations there, talking about methodological individualism and how we've kind of lost, become confused, divorced the theoretical foundations of social capital. So I want to change approach a little bit now and look at why there are so many different approaches to social capital. And social capital has been approached from many different disciplines with different epistemological and ontological foundations. There's been all these different levels of interest, from the individual to a group to the whole of society to different contexts to different social activities to different kinds of outcomes, different perspectives of benefit, that the social capital benefits individuals or it benefits the group or society as a whole. And of course, different methodological requirements. You know, some people have approached this with the need to be able to do quantitative research, and some qualitative, and some from different theoretical perspectives. And of course, the need for measurement as well. So we see then that there is considerable diversity and complexity in definitions and approaches. And we wanted to explore how much of this. So what I did was I reviewed 250 peer-reviewed journal articles, and I looked for the definitions of social capital that were being used. I also looked at a variety of other things like the conceptual approach, methodological approach, and so forth. What we found was there was this enormous amount of diversity. We see the contemporary authors who are listed here at the top, often I think because authors feel like they need to acknowledge these contemporary authors for definitions of social capital. But the interesting thing is we see 76 other definitions that are cited fewer than 5 times. So 250 articles, I found 356 definitions, and I found, well, must be 90 odd different definitions of social capital in those 250 articles. Also interesting is that about 25, so about 10% didn't clearly define social capital at all. And another almost as many used their own definition or didn't cite anybody at all. So we certainly don't have any kind of agreement about what social capital means, and we have this enormous amount of diversity in the literature. And this is quite recent literature, published after January 2019. So if we have a look, we're looking for key themes that are consistent across all these different definitions. So Putnam focused on social organization and gave some examples of what that might mean, such as networks, norms, and social trust, and identified coordination and cooperation as the outcomes of social capital. Coleman also identified that it was a variety of different things, mostly about social structures and producing or facilitating the actions of actors. So again, sort of focusing on that outcome side. These definitions are very, very similar. They have quite different theoretical foundations. They both describe resources, so linked to or embedded in relationships. So the networks being that core component that we see quite commonly. Nan Lin talked about resources and networks, and Portes about securing benefits and also networks. Fukuyama had a bit of a different approach, talking about informal norms, but again, identified the outcome being cooperation. The World Bank, quite similar to Putnam, institutions, relationships, norms, and the outcome being affecting the quality and quantity of society's social interactions. So this is quite similar idea to cooperation. OECD is also quite similar to Putnam's approach, networks, shared norms and values, again, facilitating cooperation. And Bowles and Gintis, trust, concern for one's associates, willingness to live by the norms and also to punish. So the sanctions are included in there as well. So I took all of those 356 different definitions, looked for consistencies and themes and the sorts of things that were mentioned quite consistently. And these are the things that I came up with. Social networks and social structures, trust, shared norms, resources, benefits, and cooperation. So if we group these together, I would describe the social networks and structures as connectedness, the trust and shared norms and so forth as sociability. Resources are just resources. And then we have a few descriptions of outcomes as well. So if we organize these into the types of conceptual or theoretical approaches to social capital that are commonly discussed, Connectedness perhaps might relate to the network approach, where the focus is just on connectedness, on the nature of networks and structures, whereas the resource approach includes resources within those networks. And the normative approach is the sociability and connected. So this is basically Putnam, James Coleman, World Bank type approach of networks, norms, and trust. We also want to acknowledge that there's lots of heterodox approaches, a huge variety and vastly different approaches that don't fit particularly well into those categories. And as I mentioned, when I surveyed those 250 articles, I tried to allocate each of them into one of those conceptual approaches. And in the end, I decided not to do that because it was very, very difficult. Some would have some characteristics of one, but characteristics also of another, and it ended up feeling like quite a subjective kind of decision to put them into one box or another. And so these heterodox approaches, they're quite elusive, they're difficult to identify, they don't stand out to me in the literature. But I think there are some examples. So Adler and Kwong's focus on goodwill, I don't think particularly fits into any of those approaches that I just mentioned. Same with sympathy by Robertson and co-authors, and also things like psychological states as well, perceptions, behavioral expectations. So we have a broad theory or understanding of the different approaches that exist in the literature. But I want to turn to what the actual theory of social capital is. And so there's kind of foundational understanding of what is a theory. I think Abend gives a good definition that it is a general proposition or logically connected system of general propositions that establishes a relationship between two or more variables. So what are the propositions associated with the theories of social capital? And so I think there's something social. So clearly social capital is something social. We'll keep it quite vague and broad for now. That is capital. And that capital, we might mean that quite literally or more metaphorically, but I think capital is something that has a potential or an ability or a capacity to produce certain kinds of outcomes. You know, if I have a $100 bill in my hand, then it has a potential to do a whole lot of things. I can go and buy different things, spend on different things. It can produce a variety of different outcomes. So what we're really saying is that there is a causal relationship between the something social and certain kinds of outcomes. So we might be able to annotate that theory like this. Social capital X has a causal relationship with Y, as in the outcomes, in a particular context. But there's a lot of questions still remain. You know, what is the X? What is the form of social capital that we're actually talking about? Where does it actually come from? What is the source? What does the X do? What are the outcomes of social capital? And there's some quite different ideas in the literature about this, how we might separate the source and the form and the outcomes of social capital. So using an analogy of electricity network, some authors may regard social capital as the wires or social infrastructure, whereas others regard it as the electricity or social resources that run along those wires. And still yet others may consider it the conductivity of the environment. So the norms, the trust, the belonging that enable or facilitate those flows of benefits. So some authors may include one or more of these different ideas in their approach to social capital. So I just want to acknowledge that this analogy originally came from Stretzer and Woolcock, and I've just extended it by adding conductivity of the enabling environment. So getting to a typology, trying to graphically, visually represent these things. So we're going to try and separate the source, the form, and the outcomes of social capital. And we've said that the form is this potential, this ability to be able to do something. And if we include our little annotation of the theory here, then we know that context is also really, really important in the realization of any particular outcomes. So the outcomes could be benefits. So things like this, and this is a long list that I've compiled from the literature, things like cooperation are very often mentioned, as well as giving and sharing and social introductions, pro-social actions, information flows. There's a long list here. We know also that social capital can produce downsides as well. Things like corruption and crime and exclusion and isolation and so forth can also come about as a result of that potential or ability or capacity. I also want to reference that there's dynamic interrelationships, that really the outcomes feed back into sources. When people act cooperatively, that in itself can become a source that influences the nature of norms and trust and networks and so forth. So there's very dynamic interrelationships involved. The sources could be things like this at different levels of analysis. This comes from David Halpern's 2005 book. To me, most of these are simply correlational rather than actually being sources, but perhaps they have an influence on the social capital we're talking about, but these are fine for now. And we can drop in all of the themes that we identified from the definitions, so networks and social structures and trust and so forth. However, resources I've placed over here under context. Resources clearly are really important in social capital, but I'm not certain that it's part of the form depending on how you define what resources are. So for Nan Lin, resources are really personal resources that become social resources when they're mobilized. So we can't really go around and add the value of my bank account and my car and my house and everybody else's bank account and house and car and call that social capital. No, that's part of the context. It's mobilized, but I'm not sure we can say that it's the form of social capital. It's the ability to mobilize those resources, to me, is what social capital is all about. So this can provide a general kind of understanding of how we might organize this, the source, the form, and the outcomes of social capital. And we can analyze the fundamental causal relationship, if you like, about social capital as networks that produce cooperation. Relationships matter, basically, is kind of the core understanding of social capital. But we have all of these other things included here as well, because it's not just networks, of course, that do that. There's other things that have a causal relationship with the kind of outcomes that we're interested in. So if we overlay our electricity grid analogy over the top here, we'll see that wires are the networks. Electricity is those resources and the context, and the conductivity of the environment is the things like the trust and the norms and belonging that may or may not actually produce the mobilization of those resources. So another way to think about this, coming from Kwong and Adler in 2014, they talked about how individuals must have the opportunity for social exchange. And if you're not connected to anybody, you don't know anybody, that can be quite difficult to do. Must be motivated towards exchange. So trust and belonging need to be involved here to facilitate that motivation. And there needs to be some sort of capability or resource for exchange to realize some outcomes. So this logic schema is focused towards exchange. Different types of outcomes may not quite fit into this approach, but I think it helps us to understand how these different aspects can be quite important for understanding social capital. We can also overlay the conceptual approaches over this typology as well. So the network approach focuses exclusively on networks. So it's the form and structure of the networks, which isn't just a single approach, there's a variety of different approaches, but what they have in common is that they focus on a network analysis, basically. So mapping ties and identifying configurations, the density, the segregation, the holes, the closure, basically the structure of the network. So we can see that it sits right here. And this can produce some really interesting understandings of the way in which people are connected and the ways in which that can generate certain kinds of outcomes and benefits. The resource approach then would be resources and networks. And the resource approach really is a rebranding of social resource theory that Nan Lin was working on for a long time before publishing his 2001 book. So social resources are defined as the wealth, the power, the reputation, as well as social networks that may include material resources, such as land and house and cars and so forth, as well as symbolic goods such as education and membership in clubs, as well as family name, reputation, fame, and so forth. And from this perspective, social capital contains elements that intersect structure and action. So embeddedness, accessibility, and use aspects. So we see that it fits here. And I think this is one of the few approaches to social capital that has a real potential to understand social stratification and inequality. Because if a particular group or social grouping doesn't actually have resources to mobilize, then a lot of the benefits of social capital can't be realized. You know, if you live in an agricultural community and nobody has a tractor, then that can't be shared. You know, you can't be given, no one can help in that way. So the presence of resources can help to explain inequality. The normative approach would fit here, you know, networks, trust, norms, and so forth. And I won't talk a great deal more about that. What we can see is that the sources may be different depending on the approach that we take. So the big long list that we had before from David Halpern, instead, from the network approach, it may be factors that create and maintain those networks. From the resource approach, it might be factors that create and maintain the social resources and facilitate their mobilization. And from the normative approach, it might be those things that shape the nature of social norms and sanctions, as well as trust and identity, and etc. Probably quite a lot of other things as well, because this is really just a list of some of those things. We can also overlay the dimensions approach here. The structural dimension of social capital is those impersonal configuration of linkages between people and units. A relational dimension is the personal relationships of trust and obligations and respect and friendship. And the cognitive dimension being those representations and interpretations, systems of meaning among parties that provides the foundation for interaction and exchange that's so important. So I think we can use this typology to start to understand how some of these different approaches, some of these different categorizations of social capital fit within our overall theory. Bonding and bridging would fit here. Bonding and bridging is different types of network connections effectively, or network structures. But I don't know that my typology works particularly well for this, because we're talking about social heterogeneity as being one of the key definers of the difference between bonding and bridging. And it's assumed that they then have different trust and norms and so forth as a result of that, provide different access to resources and a variety of different outcomes. So I think we probably need to do a little more work to understand how bonding and bridging fits into this typology. We can also understand individual perspectives and actually place the things that are being focused on here. So Putnam networks, norms, and trust that result in cooperation. So I think an important thing a lot of people that ignore with Putnam's approach is that it's features of social organization, and the networks, norms, and trust are just examples. Potentially it's all of these things and more is what social organization actually means. And I think there is a little bit of a challenge here that by specifically identifying cooperation as an outcome, it doesn't really allow us to include the downsides of social capital. So it's networks, norms, and trust, but only where it produces cooperation. But if the same things produce downsides, then presumably it's not social capital. And that's obviously a bit of a challenge for us. Lin's definition, resources and networks. Run through these quite quickly. Fukuyama focuses on norms that produce cooperation, and we can do this for anyone's approach, any definition of social capital. So this is the World Bank's 6 dimensions of social capital. We have groups and networks. We have trust and solidarity. We have cooperation over there on the right side. We have information flows and communication. Now, communication I don't really have anywhere, but I'd probably place it as a source over here of social capital. We have social cohesion, which is similar, I guess, to belonging. And we have empowerment, which I've added. This just emphasizes that this is only a list of things, and potentially there's a whole lot more that we haven't included here that could be included. So as you can see, it's a little bit of a mix of the form and the outcomes of social capital. And to me, at least within this typology, this sort of theory logic schema, it's a bit confused. We can also look at different contexts, and we can also understand different outcomes as well. So a famous one is James Coleman's discussed how wholesale diamond merchants in New York would lend bags of diamonds for examination before sale without any formal contracts or insurance. So reduced transaction costs here is the key outcome. And potentially it's any or all of these things here that actually produce that kind of outcome. And we could dig in and explore the ways in which trust or networks or norms actually shape the nature of human action and experience that produce that outcome that we're interested in. And of course, we may also identify that it also produces exclusion and isolation. The same kinds of networks and norms and trust can also have downsides as well. I'm going to skip over this. Just wanted to acknowledge that each from different theoretical foundations, even the meaning of each of these individual things might be quite different. And I wanted to use an example of norms, that from different approaches, the meaning of norms can actually be quite different. But I'm running a little short on time. So if you wanted to, you can go back in the video and have a look at this to see what I mean. We can also use this typology to understand different measurement approaches, because it's quite difficult to measure a lot of these things directly because they're relatively intangible and difficult to observe. So we might use proxies to measure social capital. And certainly a lot of the outcomes of social capital have been used as proxies. A popular one is the incidence of social support, for example. And because if people are supporting other people, then that would suggest that social capital exists. But I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding that the social support is social capital. But really, I think we can differentiate that it's simply a proxy for the existence of social capital. Similarly, we might measure social heterogeneity, or we might look at education levels or consumption habits. There's a variety of different things we might look at when we measure social capital to give us an indication of the social capital that exists. But I think it's important to understand whether it's a source or a form and the causal relationships that might be involved, so we don't confuse things. And this typology might help that process. I think we can also identify what's missing, because there's quite a lot missing. Power isn't mentioned, communication isn't mentioned, social identity isn't there. We don't have a place for goodwill or sympathy. I had to add in empowerment before when we looked at the World Bank. Morality, cognitive processes. There's a lot that's missing from this, because all I've really done is I've included the key themes that have come out of the definitions out of the literature. So I think we can take this further and we can improve this a lot more. Human capital, where does it fit in? So I think a lot of individual competencies, those skills and abilities that individuals have to be able to communicate, to be able to have empathy with people, are an important source of social capital. And of course, the information and skills are really those resources that may be mobilized as well. So perhaps it's part of the context that produces outcomes. Universality, none of these things are universal. And I think it's really important that we don't treat any of these things as being universal. Otherwise, it just glosses over the differences of class and gender and ethnicity and every other cleavage of society, which then makes it incapable of understanding power and inequality and discrimination. There isn't one norm. Norms are experienced differently from person to person and from group to group. And I think this kind of approach can universalize unless we're careful to understand that there are those kinds of differences. So I want to take it a little bit further now and actually try and get into some core themes, see if we can actually identify what's going on behind the scenes here, because all of these things really are just lists. They're not really the core themes of what we're talking about. And as we've already identified, there's things that are missing. This is a list, and there's probably some things that are missing as well. So what are these core ideas? I think the outcomes really are about social action. For the most part, James Coleman was quite explicitly about it creating actions of actors. Nan Lin talked a lot about social action, the way in which resources are mobilized through social action. So I think action relates to the vast majority of these outcomes, but there's a little bit of a conflict there with outcomes, say, related to mental health, where there might not be a specific and tangible outcome, but people, as a result of social capital, feel connected and feel happy and feel empowered or something like that. Is that an outcome or not? I'm not sure it fits particularly, but it seems to make sense. So really, if we're talking about action, then we're talking about the nature of human experience that actually shapes the nature of that action. And then, of course, anything that influences human experience would be a source of social capital. But the concern here is that this is just far too broad. This is just a theory of absolutely everything. What does this actually help us to do or explain? How can we use this in empirical research? So I think we can narrow it down a little bit. We can dig in to what this is. So I'm reasonably happy to accept that the outcomes are actions. And then perhaps we can separate here the form into the social structures as well as the predispositions. So this represents a very common duality in understanding society and social action of the role of structure and perhaps of agency. Or if we talk about Habermas's theory, the system and the life world. And clearly, I think everybody can see that there are two main ways that influence social action, the way in which we perceive and think about the world and the structures that may constrain or enable these kinds of actions. The context within which we act is also potentially quite important. Context there and the resources that may exist, and of course, the influences of those things as well. So I want to dig in a little bit. This is coming to the end of the presentation. I want to dig into a little bit about this idea about predispositions and whether that's actually a core idea, because I think all of the common themes we see in the literature about permitting and facilitating cooperation and the attitudes and all of these things represent a predisposition towards others that embodies that potential ability or capacity. So if we explore the potential merits of this kind of approach, then predispositions can involve self-interest, normative influence, cognitive bias, habit, instinct, and influence of coordinating institutions, morality, and religion. So when we were talking about this homo socio-capitalist before, potentially this kind of approach can include a variety of different explanations and understandings of human experience and action. Beyond just simply utility maximization or the role of norms, for example, in shaping human action. So predispositions allow for intentionality, so hence does not ignore the important role of human agency. And the reason I was focusing on predisposition rather than disposition is that the prefix pre is the state before or in advance of a situation. So therefore it does not predetermine action. It allows for that calculation and intention and agency and context to all take part that can produce positive or negative outcomes, or in fact no outcomes at all. And a focus on predispositions reflects that potential nature of social capital, since any set of predispositions does not necessarily result in any particular outcome. You know, you can have norms and trust, but then if a disaster occurs, a train crashes, those norms and trust don't predetermine certain outcomes. You know, intentionality and calculation and agency and context and so many things can come into play in shaping the outcomes that occur in any particular situation. So I think there's some questions then to ask about this idea of predispositions, whether this is a useful way to think about social capital. And for me, it is the form and core of social capital beyond lists and examples. You know, I constantly am talking about this kind of idea of predispositions as what social capital is all about. But I'm also acutely aware that I'm placing my own theoretical perspective, my own worldview on this. You know, I'm basically a social constructionist. I've read Habermas extensively, and I believe very strongly in system and life world. So for me, it makes a lot of sense. But perhaps it's not actually all that useful or suitable for theory building and empirical inquiry. You know, how do we take these kinds of ideas and apply it to investigation of the real world? I'm a little less sure about this. And I'm even less sure about whether or not it can be universally understood and accepted and applied. You know, we need to be able to have an understanding of social capital that allows it to be applied within economics and sociology, but also by environmental scientists such as myself 20 years ago, as well as people in public health and in business and in accounting and in so many different areas that don't necessarily have the understanding of these kind of deeper theoretical philosophical concepts. So summary. So social capital is corrective to asocial understandings of the world. I think that's pretty universal, or certainly very, very common. But unfortunately, the theoretical foundations are often unclear and uncertain, and we often just default to reductionism and methodological imperialism. And I think this undermines the corrective potential that we originally sought to achieve with social capital. So approaches tend to focus on some combination of connectedness, resources, and sociability. And I'm hopeful that the typology might give us some opportunities to explore our theories, our methodologies, the ways in which we approach social capital, to understand them better, to see the similarities and differences, to separate the source, form, and outcomes so we can basically do better research, understand relationship of measurement proxies, and understand also what's missing, what we might be overlooking in the approach that we're taking. A few things then for us to consider as social capital researchers is, what are the propositions of our approach to social capital? Can we get back to that kind of idea of theory building and understand what it is that we're actually saying social capital does in our particular research context? Asking that question of the nature of human experience and action. Are we relying on a very asocial view of human experience, or are we actually being excessively or overly social in our approach? Are there some interdisciplinary understandings of human experience and action that we could incorporate that would add value to our research? What assumptions are involved in our approach? I think in some approaches, there's some quite significant assumptions that aren't necessarily tested and evaluated or justified. So it'd be good to examine what assumptions we're making, and particularly whether or not our methodological approach is ideally suited to our particular investigation, our particular research question or context. I think we sometimes just default to what we're familiar with or what we're told we should do, without necessarily thinking about whether it actually fits and helps. And ultimately, whether the approach we're taking helps to resolve the problem we hope it will address. If we want to correct asocial ways of thinking about the world, is our approach doing that as effectively as it could be, or could we modify it in some way to achieve that goal better? So references is quite extensively based on literature. I've really just tried to compile the existing ideas that are out there. There's a huge amount of fantastic research and writing that's been done on social capital, tens of thousands of articles, and there's a lot of really good gems in amongst all of that. I realize this is small. You can pause if you want to have a look at these, or send me an email if you need to. And that's really it. Open for questions and discussion. I see this really as my perspective and ways I organize these thoughts, and I'm really interested to hear from others about whether it's helpful and how we might be able to modify it to help other people to understand this as well. So questions or discussion?
Tristan, I've actually been, sorting that out in the beginning. Or while you're actually been discussing, etc. And we've got a little bit of a queue going, which is wonderful. So many questions. But did you want to work through those first, the ones that came through registration, and then a few more that have come through, and then just hands up, just free for all?
Let's take from people who are in the room first, shall we?
Well, Bernard's in the room. He had a question. Where are you? We're trying to keep track of everybody. Bernard?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm Bernardo. That's why I
didn't
pay attention. Okay, that doesn't matter. Well, I referred to the questions I already sent you. I don't have it. I wrote it a couple of days ago, but I was most interested in some examples I cited there in my questions, and for example, in social capital in farming, or because of your background in New Zealand, and well, it's very important here in Argentina also, the farming sector, and also examples of the history of this social capital, especially what is first in countries like ours, where institutions are weak, we could say. For example, enforcing contracts or doing business is very problematic due to institutional weakness, which makes transaction costs very, very expensive. How can we proceed, or how can we see it? Are institutions first, or is it social capital first, and then comes? We'll translate all these in institutions that make a sound environment for economics or for progress. So I just want to hear from you in this direction, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernardo. I think it's a very difficult question because we need to change kind of everything to improve social capital. Institutions clearly play a very important role as part of that structural context for within which action people actually act. So changes to institutions can play a really important role in shaping the nature of social capital, as can changing the nature of the norms or the trust at a societal level as well as building perhaps more institutions, but not necessarily what you might think of as institutions, but simply social groupings that come together to achieve certain ends. And those social groupings can be a really powerful way to shape new norms that exist only within that social grouping and can help to work to change the societal level norms and trusts and understandings that shape human action. So I think it's quite a difficult and challenging problem, and it's one that everybody in every country in the world has, is how we can shape social capital at a societal level in a positive way, and how we can actually go about these really quite large scale changes that can be quite slow and can take quite a lot of time to implement.
Thank you, Tristan.
I think that the big benefit of this kind of typology and social capital in general is that it can help us to understand the sorts of things we can change. It can help us to start thinking about the role of trust and norms and networks, institutions and so forth in shaping the type of actions that we're seeing in our context of interest. I think that I see social capital as one of those. The big benefit is that it can shape our understanding and therefore direct our action towards making change. Marion, who's next?
Anna's next. I'm just actually looking at Anna's question and wondering, Anna, did you want to ask the question yourself? It's about, it's an very interesting question, obviously. So Anna, did you want to ask Tristan the question and have a little discussion?
Oh, hey, hi. Yeah, I was just wondering about how to distinguish whether or place the issue of trust in this realm of social capital, because we're not sure whether trust is an entity by our concept on its own, or is it part of social capital? Is it the same as social capital? Everything that I've read so far is kind of here and there. It's kind of confusing.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because quite a lot of people have literally equated trust and social capital as being the same thing. But I think from what you've seen of the typology, and at least from broad understandings of social capital is so much more than just trust. And when we dig into what we mean by trust, what we really mean is perceptions of trustworthiness, how we see other people's trustworthiness and how that shapes our action towards other people, our social action, as a result of those perceptions of trust. And so I think trust is one of those very complicated concepts that tends to be very contextual. I trust somebody in a particular context in a particular way, but I don't even trust that same person in a different context. And so I think it really does all come down to, again, using that idea of predispositions, the ways in which perceptions of trustworthiness shapes our predispositions to act towards other people in certain ways. Not sure if that perfectly answers your question, but I think there's a wide variety of different understandings of trust and understandings of how trust fits into theories of social capital.
Thank you. I'll think about it more. Thank you.
Tristan, Chris Paul is next. He was here, but he's gone. So we might move on to the next question with Yannon. who is here with us still.
Hello, me.
Yes.
Okay. So it is a really good class. So my question is like, have you ever come across a concept called social liability? As I was reading the other day, I think it represents the opposite of social capital. While social capital like relates to positive outcomes, social liability relates to the negative outcomes.
I certainly have come across the concept. I think that the unfortunate thing about social capital is that the word capital implies that the outcomes are positive. But I think as we've seen from the typology, that the same sorts of potential or ability or capacity that represents social capital can also produce negative outcomes. And because we think of capital as being positive, we tend to not think about those negative outcomes that might occur. And so in that respect, I think the social liability really is the same as social capital, but it's just more focusing on the potential to produce the negative outcomes rather than the positive.
Okay, thank you.
Tim was next. Thank you, Yana. Tim's got a few questions for you, I think, Tristan.
Good.
Well, thank you. My main question is, if we've only been exposed to, say, one school of social capital and, even practiced and worked in it, where should we begin to broaden our horizons? And I mean, I think I'm so thankful for today's talk. I've been waiting for you to talk, have your talk. And so I'm very thankful.
Thanks, Tim. I think the broadening horizons, I think, involves just simply reading a bit more of that perhaps heterodox literature that I was talking about. That's quite elusive and difficult to identify. And it's something that when I'm asked, what is this literature? I can't actually even put my finger on it. And I would say, go and read Norman Uphoff. Perhaps go and read Adler and Kwong and Adler 2014. Perhaps these are some of that more heterodox literature that exists, but it's quite difficult to identify what it is. In the 250 articles, just talking about those 250 articles I reviewed, almost all of them were empirical studies that looked at one thing or another in a particular context. Almost none were really discussing the kinds of theory building and conceptual understandings that I've been talking about today. So in amongst the tens of thousands of articles on social capital, quite a small proportional percentage of them actually can progress and really deepen our understanding of social capital beyond the empirical inquiry that relates to a particular context and a particular something of interest.
That's a good point. Thank you. And I'll definitely look up Uphoff and Adler. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Perhaps I'll try and put together a list of literature that I think might be of interest. I think a lot of the people that I've cited in my presentation also potentially would be of interest. I mean, I've read Ben Fine's work extensively. He has basically called for social capital to be abandoned. So he's kind of on the other side as I am. I'm quite critical of social capital, but believe it has use and has potential and promise. But I think Ben Fine's work can be really illuminating to the kinds of issues that we've been talking about.
Yep.
Thank you.
Tim was also asking about how he can source further development in this area, and I flagged with him that we now have the green light for ISCA. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So these webinars have really driven the impetus for us to create an international association to bring more people together and facilitate more of these kinds of conversations. And so that's underway, and we'll be opening membership quite soon, and we'll start to see a lot more events and discussions and opportunities to come together and progress these ideas.
Okay, we have two people next. Everybody's important, but Sabita has a question, and also Beverly. So if you would like to go ahead, perhaps in that order, Sabita and then Beverly. Not sure.
Well, Sabita's still here, actually, just looking at the list.
Yes.
So we move on to Beverly.
Yeah.
Okay, forgive me, I got a bit of a cold, but you talked about causation, Tristan, and I was curious about your idea of causation when you referred to model. Ideally, we don't necessarily say causation because sometimes there's latent variables and there are other variables that we can't readily recognize or see that are underlying the actions of others. And I was curious as to what was your take on that?
I think that there can be multiple causalities. There always are, really, with social capital, multiple causalities. So I think my goal there with the theory development was just identifying at that very broad kind of level that if we're saying that relationships are important, then we're really saying that relationships have a causal relationship with some sort of outcome that's important or that's beneficial. And so digging into those very broad scale kinds of propositions of causality that of course involve incredibly complex multi-causalities that are non-linear, that, representing the normal kinds of things we see in the social environment. And so I think that to answer your question, my discussion of causality was at that very broad propositional level rather than getting down to the sort of factor level.
Okay. Thank you.
Who's next, Marion?
Is Sabita there yet?
No, don't think so.
No. Okay. I've changed. Mike, I think, has a question. Mike's been struggling with his wife's iPad, I believe, but he might want to ask a question.
And we've got a couple of people with a hand up. I assume they're in the queue.
Heather, yeah, Heather has a question for you. Maybe while Mike's sorting it out.
Well, Telly had a question. He's had his hand up for quite a while.
Yeah, Heather's either.
How about you, Telly? I saw you had your hand up almost from the beginning.
Thank you, Tristan. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for your presentation in terms of providing an overview. But I've got quite a lot of things I wish to say. Firstly, your starting point about comparison of the two communities, how one community seems to be functioning quite well, where the other wasn't functioning as well. It's kind of this is just an hypothesis I was building. That, okay, maybe if I was to ask you, what were the differences, perhaps, rather than me to share my hypothesis, what were the differences in terms of the contextual issues for that? That's firstly. And the other point was, for me, my criticism, or like yourself, I'm critical of the concept of and the application of social capital, because it means all things to all man and women, as it were. That Becker, Coleman, and Putnam, given the context they were in and the history of America, it's as if they must have lived in a parallel universe, because they didn't, when Putnam's conception of network, norms, and trust, how does that fit into the network of the diversity of America, in terms of whose network was he referring to, whose norms was he referring to, when he was talking about the issue of trust, and it reminds me of a paper by Madeleine Leonard, 2004, on a reflection from Belfast, in which she used the bridging and bonding capital, given the context, the history of Northern Ireland, which is Catholic, and the Protestants, of the history of the Troubles, the settlers community, and who are the Protestants, and the Irish communities there, who are the Catholic. And in effect, they were very critical of Putnam. And the other point I wish to make is, I think the World Bank abandoned the use of their social capital project, if I'm correct. But I've noticed the business schools have used the concept of social capital without really providing a clear, concrete definition of it. It tends to be very functionalist, really. And so in public health, but there's also been criticism from the public health sector in terms of their lack of engagement in the issue of racism, gender, and addressing the structural inequalities. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I don't know if I've made sense at all.
To your first question, was that about the land care groups that I was interested in researching?
That's right, yes.
So in the end, I didn't conduct that research because I didn't feel like I could engage in empirical inquiry using social capital and produce the kinds of results that I wanted to. So I would only be able to describe the observations that I'd made just simply being a participant in land care groups. So I don't really have a research answer for you about that one. But to your point about Becker, Coleman, Putnam, World Bank, the dominant kind of approach to social capital, I think that thinking about humans as being rational, utility maximizers, tends to push us towards universalizing assumptions, because if we're thinking about everybody as pursuing the same ends and having the same preferences, then we're not thinking about the different preferences that people have. We're not thinking about those differences that exist within society. And I tried to make the point within the typology that we can't universalize across these kinds of issues, because norms aren't a static thing that apply universally to everybody. Everybody experiences those norms differently, and there can be very considerable differences in the experience of those norms across all of those normal cleavages of society. Norms affect men and women very differently in many cultures, specific norms, as do ethnicity or religion or race or socioeconomic status or educational background. All of these things can significantly influence the way in which people experience norms. And so I think that the dominant approaches to social capital, following rationality, narrow sort of concept of rationality, tends to push us towards universalizing these things. And that's why I'm really encouraging the researchers to explore these theoretical foundations and to think a little differently about what these underlying ideas are, so that hopefully we can actually understand the differences that exist, and we can design research that's capable of understanding all of the sorts of things that you're talking about.
And just aside, I was mindful of Sabatis and Edward's presentation of Trinidad and America. And one concept I wanted to suggest to them was the concept of a social suffering, given the context they're in, the social suffering of Black people, African American, as well as the indigenous people in America, as well as social suffering in a colonial and post-colonial context of the Caribbean, as if you're discussing social capital and why, as Sabatis' paper about educational gap and educational achievement of a particular group, and okay, she used Bourdieu, but I was also thinking the concept of social suffering might be interested if she was to integrate it into her theorizing.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think this is where there's opportunities with social capital to include these ways of understanding social processes. And I think my goal with this presentation was to emphasize just how economic a lot of the approaches to social capital are, so that we can have the opportunity to more deliberately change that. You know, if our goal really is to meaningfully include the social, then let's try to move past those quite sort of narrow understandings of human experience and action by including, like you're saying, the sorts of things that you're talking about. You know, I think we can, the real opportunity here, the key slide for me in my presentation was the Goldilocks, you know, the real opportunity here to include the inter and multidisciplinary understandings of social experience. We don't need to be tied to understanding cognitive processes alone or understanding, you know, narrow instrumental rationality alone. We have the potential to include everything, and including the sorts of things that you're talking about.
Lovely. I think Heather's next.
Is Heather still here?
She was.
Oh, Heather is here. Heather, did you have a question or comment?
Sorry.
Sorry, Heather, we're not able to hear you.
Sorry, you can't hear me.
Oh, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, so I basically wrote my question in the chat, which might be easier for you because it's quite noisy where I am. But I wanted to know whether it was enough of a theory that social capital is a form of capital. You know, I always teach my students that because it's a form of capital, you have to invest in it in order for it to have an outcome. You know, in your theory model, you were talking, and by the way, thank you very much for this. Very, very helpful indeed. The concept that, you know, X is affecting Y, and I feel that X has to be invested in order to affect Y. So you actually have to build and invest in social capital. It might have a negative outcome, just like, frankly, investing in shares might have a negative outcome too. But it might have a negative outcome, but whatever, if you want an outcome of any kind, even organized crime, you have to invest in it. And to me, that is, you know, do you think that's a theory? To me, that's a theory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I didn't talk about the investment side of social capital, of creating that potential or ability, but I think that we can see that almost all of those aspects of social capital, all of the form, if you like, of social capital can be invested in. You know, we can work on shaping the nature of norms and developing and strengthening norms. We can work on trust. We can set up structures. We can build networks. We can empower people. All of these things can be invested in. And so I think that it just strengthens the idea that this is really a form of capital that we need to take serious consideration of. And if you read Nan Lin's work, so Nan Lin, as I mentioned in his 2001 book, when he rewrote that book to make it social capital, he extensively dug into what capital means. And one of the things that capital means is it's the surplus of production, basically, surplus value that's produced. And so I think we see a lot of the characteristics of social capital as being that surplus value that's produced effectively as a byproduct of other activities. And so again, these are ideas that strengthen this idea that social capital is a legitimate and important form of capital.
Thanks, Heather. Tristan, we have some other questions. Celine's had her hand up for a little while. Abdelatif had a question from the registration. He's now joined us. And Sheila has a question. So
should we just go in the order of the hands up?
The hands up, yes, that might be easy, which is Celine first at this stage, then Sheila, then Abdelatif.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Tristan, for this amazing presentation. So actually, it's a shame Sabeta left, because I was particularly interested in the question she posed. So I don't know if Tristan, we could read it, or if you could see the question, and if you could speak to it, even though she's not around, it might be helpful to some of us. So if you could speak, if you have particular experiences to share in that direction. So she was asking that she sees social network analysis as a practical method to analyze social capital and the use of modern tools like NVivo and R. I don't know if you'll be able to speak to that, if you have any experience to share in that angle. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I think that social network analysis is a very practical method, and I think it can produce some really interesting and valuable kinds of understandings of the world. I think that social network analysis suits certain types of research questions really, really well, where we're looking to understand the ways in which people are connected and how that can shape certain types of outcomes. So I think it can be really valuable, but I think unfortunately, the network approach to social capital can also be used to universalize and to make assumptions about different types of outcomes based on correlation alone. So with network analysis, we may look at a particular network structure and we may then conclude certain characteristics of those networks and certain outcomes that we would expect to find. And that can universalize across the differences of experience within those networks and can make assumptions that I think are a little bit difficult to justify. So my answer would be really good for certain types of research questions, but can be used in ways that maybe reinforces the problems we're hoping to avoid or to solve.
Right. Okay, thank you for this.
I think well, probably Celine, most definitely part of the association's work would be to, and we had a discussion about another system called Kumo last night, was to build strength in that area. So social network analysis, etc. Yeah, definitely on the agenda. And Sabita is actually, I think, had to go. But yes, she will be involved in some discussions around that also within the association. But
Great.
thanks.
That's great. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Back to you, Tristan.
I think my comments apply also more broadly that certain approaches and understandings of social capital can be really good for certain types of research questions and can be really quite ineffective for other types of research questions.
Makes
Just
a
the
lot of
same
sense.
as certain methodologies are really good for investigating certain types of research questions, but are really not for other types of research questions.
Yeah.
So it's really just about identifying those things and being more aware of it. And this is where I'm quite hopeful that the typology I presented might help us to understand some of the logic schema and, some of the ways in which for certain questions, we really do need to look at the existence of resources in the context and the ways in which they're mobilized. For other contexts or for other research questions, that isn't relevant. And hopefully that we can improve our understanding and we can design research that's more effective.
Thanks.
Who's next, Marion?
Was that, sorry, that wasn't Sheila, was it?
No, that was Celine.
Celine. Either Sheila or Adelatif is next.
Oh, Sheila, if you want to ask your question.
Sure, hi. Tristan, thank you. This has been an amazing presentation as I'm quite confused about social capital. My research focus is how childless, child-free elders make decisions as they age. And a lot of my research keeps coming back to social capital. And to put this in context, I'm in the United States. So we do not have universal health care, and insurance does not cover care in the home or anything like that unless you're very, very low income. So a lot of the care, a lot of the decisions, and a lot of the care for people as they age, it's assumed that their children will provide that care. And as we know, our aging population is getting more and more child-free. So to get to the point, in my research, the lines are blurred as social capital, but they talk about social networks, social ties, cultural capital, things like that. So and then in speaking with my thesis advisor, she just rolls her eyes. Now I'm in sociology, so I don't think she wants me to go down this road, but I'm really intrigued. I keep coming back to it. Maybe, as you were just saying, this isn't the right kind of research question for social capital. So any guidance you can give would be much appreciated.
Yeah, I think, like I always guide people, that if you're more interested in a constituent part of what social capital is, then focus on that. You don't need to bring in social capital, which is this very broad, umbrella concept that I think is really useful in helping us to organize and identify and understand the broad social processes and the broad ideas, focus our attention on what's important. But if you already know what's important for your research context, then you may be able to focus exclusively on that. So it may be about social support or the norms around social support that are what's important for your research context. Then you needn't necessarily dive into the social capital literature and understanding and conceptualizations, which is, as you've seen, a bit of a mess and can be quite difficult. You may be able to focus exclusively on that thing that you're most interested in. And I think that it's difficult for me to guide somebody to do quality research on social capital, because I'm asked, well, how do I measure it rigorously and effectively? Yep, I'm not really sure. There's a lot of ways to do it, a lot of different approaches. Some of them are really well grounded in theory. Some of them aren't so much. Some of them make a lot of assumptions. So it's difficult for me to say, yes, absolutely, use social capital. It's a fantastic concept, and you'll produce amazing results with the research that you're doing. And you'll fly through the research program that you're doing, and everyone will love it and think that it's robust and scientific and fantastic. I'm not sure. I think in some ways I'd almost say, and this is perhaps coming from me, it seems a little strange, I'd say if you have an opportunity to not research on social capital for a degree, then perhaps that's a good thing.
Okay, I appreciate your honesty. Thank you.
Sheila, I was in a similar situation to you when I came across this person called Tristan Claridge. But I was lucky that my supervisor had heard at a conference a speaker on social capital and brought them in as a second supervisor or third supervisor because they wanted to learn more about it. So, but it's all context bound, of course, but I understand the space that you're in. We're always here if you need us, though.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate any support I can get. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm just starting to get a bit concerned about you, Tristan. It's been a long couple of hours, but Abdelatif is here to ask his question.
Yes, please. Thank you very much, Marianne. Thank you, Tristan, for this amazing seminar, which is very insightful. Well, my question relates to my interest as a teacher educator. And here in Morocco, I'm working in Morocco, and we've had several reforms in teacher education program and syllabus, and at the same time in the education system at large. Yeah, so I'm more specialized in the field of pedagogy and linguistics and discourse analysis. And so more recently I've become, and thank you for giving me this chance, I feel like now social capital could explain some phenomena that it could provide us with some hypothesis why there is so much resistance to change and reform. But I'm not really in the field of social capital. I just would like to ask you, please, it's a similar question, Tristan, if there is some guidance or some recommendation, some references at the methodological level. I'm more oriented towards problem solving. I feel like there is resistance to reform. There is resistance to certain pedagogical models and samples and involvement and construction of those, communities of professional development or professional development communities among teachers here in Morocco, in spite of the relative availability of technology that has made life a little bit much easier to cooperate, even if people are far from one another. So please, do you feel that this field, I say more than discipline, could provide us with some track of research that could help us understand the situation better and probably solve some of those problems or contribute to the solution of those problems from my perspective as a teacher educator? And thank you very much again.
I think the answer is yes. I do think social capital would be very useful for your particular context. I've just said, I realized to the previous person that maybe if you can avoid using social capital, you should. I don't really mean that. I mean that it can be a bit of a minefield, particularly in academic qualifications where you have very rigorous requirements for meeting theoretical, conceptual standards, methodological standards, and the uncertainty that exists in social capital can throw up a bit of difficulty in navigating those very specific requirements that exist within university departments for degrees. For conducting research and for generating new understanding and exploring a particular context, I think social capital has enormous promise. And outside of that strict degree program format, there's a lot of flexibility for you to be able to be quite creative with the ways in which you include your theory building and your methodological approaches to understand your particular context, and then to intervene in it and change and improve that context. And I think that the typology that I've presented today, as well as a lot of the other theory building and approaches that exist in the literature, which it's based upon, can provide you with a framework, if you like, for understanding perhaps what is important and what produces the kinds of outcomes that you want, so that you can then go about intervening in changing those things. You know, is it in your context about setting up new groups and social structures that bring people together? Is it about intervening at a broader level about changing norms of behavior or perceptions of trustworthiness? So the social capital framework can really guide your understanding and your direction of your particular context.
Can I just make a comment there, Tristan?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, there's a number of us here today that are actually involved in social capital, the new association, etc. And education is a big part of the interest that is actually being generated, both in all of the areas really of education. I'm at university, etc. But also in terms of leadership as well, because educational leadership is training. I actually have future headmasters or principals of schools coming in to be educated about leadership, and including social capital within that framework, I think is important. So the filtering and understanding and the change driving, this is sort of why some of us are here. So it definitely is a big opportunity.
And to further Marion's point, this could be an opportunity for a special interest group within the new association to progress these kinds of ideas, because we certainly have a lot of people interested in education and social capital, and this is something where people can collaborate and share and basically help each other to progress. We're talking about social capital. We should be connecting and collaborating and working together on it as well. So watch this space. I think there's an opportunity for this in the coming months to emerge.
And leadership as well. So incorporating leadership in the training of principals. And Beverly's nodding her head. That's the segue.
Yeah. So is Beverly the next question? Comment?
Yes.
Really quick, couple things. First, Sheila, I incorporated social capital into my dissertation when I completed my PhD. I sent you my email address so I can talk to you offline at just ad nauseum about how to go on and do that. But the key to any work in social capital is to have a good research question. You really have to understand the context of what you want to do, or you'll be all over the place. And it'll be hard to really land anywhere. So happy to help with that. Telly, real quick, I caught on to what you were talking about. You know, we've talked about rational choice, and we talked about a couple of other theories when it comes to social capital. But one of the theories that we haven't talked about is critical race theory, intersectionality, and those sorts of things, and their effect and influence on networks. So when, you know, I reviewed in my other life quite a few dissertations that tried to tackle this topic of critical race theory and integrating in intersectionality. And my words of caution to you on that would be actually one word: bias. Be very careful of bias when you go in and you use that theory. It requires, again, a very clear research question. Please don't decide your answer before you do your research. Write a good question, do the research, and apply the theory accordingly. That would be my 5 cents worth of advice.
Beverly's always a fountain of really good recommendations about research design. Always good to listen to Beverly about research design. Telly, did you want to comment or respond?
Yes, I agree with you about critical race theories, because that is one of my area of interest. But I'm not sure. Well, it depends how you're applying social capital, because the predominant approach essentially has been a very functionalist approach. Doesn't take account of the critical race dimension and intersectionality. So I'll be very cautious of trying to mix the two together. You can critique social capital from critical race theory, I will agree, but to apply it, it's another matter. I was just about to respond to your message, actually. I was, you know, a key text that I recommended 2 weeks ago, which you might know of, was Charles Mills' The Racial Contract, which you might be aware of.
My recommendation to you would be to go back to Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and the writers of the 50s, 60s, late 70s, and 80s, and even maybe go back to the Marxist critical theory, and to understand fully how that theory evolved before you apply it, because we typically work in the realm of knowledge, understanding, and application, and then we go on to analysis. So there's a lot of controversy in that theory, and there's a lot of different veins in that theory. So I would say, please construct your research question or your initial research question before you tackle that, so that you can make sure that you can, when you apply it and you undergird your research as it applies to social capital using that, you get it right.
All right, do we have any other questions?
I'm just checking, Tristan. I've actually asked people to put their hands up if they have another question, so I'm not sure. Maybe if we stop the recording and then see what other people might like to say.
Yeah, let's do that. And before I do, I'll just mention that next week is Easter in a lot of places in the world, so we're not going to have a webinar next week. The following week, we're going to have a presentation by Dr. Brian Gearan, who is going to be talking about basically social capital in educational research. We're just talking about education before, so that might be something that's quite interesting. And he's going to be talking about the slow uptake in areas that draw on psychological theories and methods. So I think that could be quite revealing. So that's in 2 weeks' time. The details are on the website. The following week after that, we have a presentation by Dr. Alexander Dill, who has a very simple way of measuring social capital, and he's going to be talking about that as part of a UN project that he's involved in. So that's in 3 weeks from now. So check out the details on our website. So I'll end the recording now. Thanks for everyone for being involved, and hopefully we'll see you at a future future